Hi, I'm Harrison Jacob, and in this video I will attempt to define the three major schools of thought regarding political economy and subsequently apply these philosophies to the idea of environmental protection, regulation, and other policies. The first philosophy that I'm going to discuss is realism, also known as mercantilism. We should include those countries and other organizations that feel that the environment is something individual, independent countries should deal with, not something where global consensus is necessary. This kind of consensus would require a greater deal of cooperation amongst the various countries in the world, which is something that realists are opposed to, or do not believe can happen realistically. Realists are all about self-sufficiency and independency, not higher degrees of globalization and interdependency, like some other philosophies are. A realist most likely views the environment, or the land base on which their country resides, as something to be utilized for its resources. A country with more resources within its borders, after all, has a much better chance of staying self-sufficient. Like I said, realists are all about self-sufficiency and independence. As a result, realists believes that resources must be secured, often militarily, to reach that goal of self-sufficiency. We can look to the history of the United States and Manifest Destiny for a good example of this, although most imperial states in the history of the world have behaved similarly. Currently, most states wouldn't really be considered imperial in the same sense that you would call them 100 years ago, in that most countries' borders are pretty well defined by now, and most don't have world domination in their to-do list, as earlier civilizations did. So what does this mean for the environment? I'm not arguing that a realist doesn't care about the environment, but only that the realist will only care for the environment as long as it is seen as a resource base with a finite amount of resources. If a country hopes to be self-sufficient, then it must rely heavily on these resources within its borders or risk becoming more dependent on other nations. So this means that those resources must be conserved, cultivated, and protected to ensure that they will be there for future generations. This is kind of a long-term goal of self-sufficiency. Someone with a vague idea that resources are everywhere for the taking may not have as much of an incentive to conserve those resources already readily available in close proximity. So the second philosophy that I'm going to talk about is liberalism. Now, liberals believe that the world is, or should be, moving towards globalization and a higher level of interdependence. Accordingly, liberals view the environment as a global problem to be solved on consensus and cooperation. Liberals do believe that this kind of consensus is not only necessary to save the environment, but possible to achieve through institutes like World Wildlife Fund and other initiatives like the Kyoto Protocol. To a liberal in France, the environmental conditions of a third world country half the globe away is just as important as the conditions in France. And if that third world country does not have the technology or resources required to implement a large-scale environmental initiative, then a French liberal will attempt to partner with a German and American liberal to go into that third world country and offer aid and other influence, or sometimes just to scold the country for not trying hard enough, and possibly imposing sanctions or tariffs on that country, further deepening their economic plight. And considering modern industrial countries like the United States and France were allowed to pollute and destroy the environment during their respective revolutions, why should current countries, who would love nothing more than to experience a similar phenomenon, be held to those current standards now? It seems clear that you would probably find very few liberals in the poorest countries. So the final philosophy that I'm going to talk about today is Marxism, obviously created by Karl Marx. To a Marxist, the issue of the environment is a further perpetuation of the class struggle between the elite, or wealthy countries, and the middle and lower classes, which would be the poorer countries. A Marxist believes that liberalism will lead to further division between the classes and create further instability and social unrest in the lower class countries, who are really being exploited by the elite countries, or at least held to unfair standards. How does this apply to the environment? In the case mentioned previously, a liberal country that believes the environment is an issue to be decided on a global scale is less willing to provide financial, institutional, or other help to those countries on the bottom who are still polluting and developing heavily, sending that country further down the hole, or at least retarding their journey through the development process. Another case in which it applies is in the exploitation of resources the environment has to offer in smaller developing countries. The few richest corporations in the world are worth more than some entire economies in the poorest countries. Therefore, it's easy for a company like Exxon to enter a developing country rich in resources like oil initially promising to pay the country back for granting concessions, but once inside, they'll create poor working conditions for the locals, and that's if they hire any locals at all, and funnel the money back to the CEOs in their home countries, instead of distributing it amongst these poor communities that they are doing business in. Because of the lack of regulation in these countries, their environment is usually even further degraded. And oftentimes, once the resource of that area is depleted or no longer cost effective, the corporation may vanish, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake.